board, by January of 2020, we'll submit all this information to the RCA, and the RCA takes time to review and approve it and open up to public comment and so on and so forth. So really, we expect to hopefully have this utility set up and in operation by January 2021, because there's a time-consuming process. Concur with the review, obviously, there is going to be some new utility set up in the title, so that has to be done, and then there's obviously some public involvement that has to go along with this, because people like you and everyone else in the municipality understand what is a stormwater utility, why are we doing it, so on and so forth. And that's a lot of the information is in this report as is, but really that information has to get out. And with that, that's my brief presentation, Chris, as promised.
Awesome. Mr. Weldon?
There's a couple of questions that I missed.
Before you go, can I just predicate all of this on the fact that this is a very brief introduction, and that Ms. Quinn-Davidson and I are in discussions about organizing a formal approach to the broader question of our investigations, our oversight of this process. So this is phase one, pre-phase one. So there you go.
What was the RFP?
To get, it's a professional services contract to get all the information together for the CPCN submission.
So would you have a list of projects you want to do?
No. This is essentially, the CPCN application is extensive and it takes a lot of time and effort. There's costs, there's policies that have to be set out, all that stuff needs to be reconciled. In addition to partially public involvement. So there's a plethora of things that we've actually drafted the RFP. I can share it with you, and you can see exactly what this is.
I guess if you're supposed to show rates, how do you know what the charge is?
Because we have to do revenue requirement, cost of service, all that stuff is outlined right here.
But you need to know what projects you want to do.
Well, that's capital. That is a part of it, but this is more operating expenses.
Oh, I understand. Okay, that's good. Then question: do you need RCA? Solid waste
so here's the answer to that question. We got an opinion from them because we asked that very question. There will be some RCA oversight likely. They give us that opinion. They won't tell us whether it's economically regulated or not, but at the bare minimum, we're going to go through the process. Because if we set one up without RCA input, they will intervene likely anyway and say you're going to need our input. Then it sets us back 6 to 9 months. So the reality is we're setting it up to anticipate they would want some input.
Okay, so it's possible they won't need RCA oversight, but is having it under AWU's umbrella kind of setting us up so we will have RCA?
Not necessarily. That's to be determined.
Thanks.
By to be determined, do you mean that at some point in the future in planning it could bifurcate and it could have a separate utility depending on the outcomes, or we're going to do it this way and it could be regulated or not?
Well, it'll likely be regulated, but not necessarily economically regulated. And that, well, I would talk to Mr. Palazzi on that question.
Jason has his hand up. Mr. Baca said.
Yeah, Jason Baca said, to answer your question, one of the reasons why and it's in this report, one of the reasons why we are pursuing and having AWU do this is there's a lot of synergy that can be gained by them doing it and not having to recreate an entirely new management structure, entirely new finance structure, all of those. So what we're trying to do is figure out how do we do this in a way that is most cost effective and efficient. So that's one of the reasons why we're going down this road with AWU right now. And obviously some of the questions about RCA regulation are going to have to be answered.
That's the good stuff. You want to what's
Yep.
the bad side too?
Yep.
Flash that.
Other questions?
Thanks.
Mr. France, you have your thinking face on. Oh, Mr. Dyson.
I might be slightly out of order, but last time we had a meeting on this,
Can we turn the lights on, somebody? Thank you.
it feels like more than a year ago, I asked about oily water separators. And I was very clear that I got from the utility, there aren't any. In the whole storm drain system, I was told there wasn't any, and I was astonished. This document says there are.
There are.
And so is all the stormwater collection system run through oily water separators and grit separators?
Not necessarily, I doubt it, but I don't know the answer to that question in its entirety.
They should be, shouldn't they?
You know what? There's an MS4. Here's what I'll say. You have to see what the permit says. So one of the things that this allows us to do is fund permit requirements, which is that we have a EPA MS4 permit. It municipal separate storm sewer permit that we have to abide by, and the requirements of whether or not you need water separators is somewhat tied to that aspect. And it
Okay.
historically has not.
Yeah,
That
all
has
right.
been way in the future, but not
All
necessary.
right, so there was some confusion, and I was astonished at the previous answer. I assume this, certainly anything we go forward needs to have appropriate oily water separators, perhaps grip garbage as well. Thank you.
Jason?
I would just add that I think what's happening is in a lot of the newer projects that we do, specifically the Spinard Road project that we just did, had a brand new oil and grit separator installed in it as well. So I think as we're going and doing newer projects, those types of systems are being installed. But there are some parts of the stormwater system that are 65 years old that don't have it because we didn't install those 65 years ago.
So you just mentioned some bit of code that probably most members of the public would understand. EPA MSA permit. So can you just briefly dive into that?
The stormwater utilities, first of all, are abundant throughout the United States. There's over nearly 2,000 around the United States. They started in around 1990 primarily because of the EPA's Water Quality Act of 97. And really what that said is you need to treat your stormwater. All the bigger cities, there's a phase 1, phase 2 approach. And we've been doing that through bonding as over time, which is kind of an unsustainable way to some degree because it can be rejected, but you still have the requirements of a permit. The EPA is an Environmental Protection Agency. They have the federal requirements that issue the municipal separate storm sewer, MS4 is the terminology. There's an MS4 permit that the city has to abide by, and it's if it's simple as that. And the reason why utilities were set up around the United States is because all the other municipalities realize that you don't have a sustainable funding mechanism. A lot of times they're tied to road projects where road projects get the pavement, asphalt, street lighting, sidewalks, get the money, then drainage is kind of a secondary thought, and if the bond doesn't pass and there's no funding, but you still have to meet this requirement. So this is a way to get that sustainable funding is by setting up utility, and that's what a lot of other places have done to meet the permit requirements. Just like a sewer utility has a permit requirement from the EPA as well. You pay it via rates because you have to meet that discharge requirement.
Questions? Mr. Wellington?
When was the last time a bond for roads and drainage failed?
I don't know.
Never.
Okay.
So there's like the $64,000 question. Can you anticipate it?
What's that?
What are people going to have to pay? What do we think? In round numbers.
Here's what I can tell you: that a lot of the fees around the United States. I'm not going to give you any guesstimate on that right now. But what I can say is around the United States, a lot of times you see around a $5 a month on average fee. It's based on lot size or impervious surface. All that stuff will be figured out and addressed during this process.
It's very complex, but not extraordinary. Okay. That's important.
Yeah,
First, Mr. Dunbar, then Mr. Dyson.
What is the typical billing mechanism? Does it go with the once a year with the property taxes?
Well, that'll also be reconciled. That's one of the reasons we're putting it under our umbrella is because we already have an existing billing system.
Oh, right. So
we would issue with our bills for our existing customers. Now there'd be other areas if they're outside. The service area may extend beyond our existing water and wastewater service area. So we would have to have new bills. But the reality is we already have a billing system in place, and we'd have to reconcile that. That'll get flushed out during this RFP process.
Mr. Dyson.
thanks. I do not see that anything north of Muldoon is included. You're not thinking of any other
That'll
areas?
be, good question. Right now, Eagle River was initially left out, but the reality is during this process, we will reevaluate that.
During this process, what?
We will reevaluate that. We have to.
Is there any system out there now?
Well, Subversa.
No, is there a stormwater
Oh, you
system?
bet, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, and they're in the permit, so we need to reconcile if that's, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but the reality is we'll all flush this all out. We could expand that or we could not. We can pass that liability on to Subversa and it's all right too. There's ways to do that, but we need to reconcile what's best for the community and we need to work with all the stakeholders to address that.
And we're a tad sensitive, that issue would be excluded, you city boys. Thank you.
Actually, it can be either way, either being excluded or included. It depends. And so, Mr. Wellington.
I would say the knee-jerk reaction on the hillside is they want to be excluded too. I just examined on your billing is with that N-Star expansion off of Candy Road that we dealt with recently. The bills come through AWU. That's what they said, the bill for that was an AWU.
But that, all assessments go through, maybe Mark can expand upon that.
Is that right?
We're the Office of Finance for all special assessment collections.
There you go.
So but those people up there, they got a bill from AWU for an NSTAR improvement, so obviously it's piggybacking on your system.
Yes.
It's not a new thing to do that.
Correct.
Any other questions? Okay, so I anticipate coming back to this question in a more methodical approach in the not too distant future after folks have had a chance to consume this nice report that was just handed to us in whatever way you find reasonable. So with that, we're going to move over to the next part of our agenda, which is a discussion of the port contract bid review and process. So let's see. I'm just going to do a quick brief on where we are and how we got here. So yes?
Just quickly, would you mind asking whoever produced this to send it to the members electronically too, just so we'll have it?
Yeah, sure. Jason, is it possible to have
Is
this?
it too big?
It's a very,
Too big of
very
a file?
large document.
But
Dropbox link,
is there a place you
something
can
like that?
post
Yes,
it?
I can figure out a way to.
Awesome.
Thank you.
send it to you guys.
Perfect. And, you know, what we can do, Jason, what we can do is have you figure out a way through whatever drives you can, get it to Desiree. She can put the link up on the utility page.
Yep.
Yeah, then
Yeah, then that's
Absolutely.
available. So that'll be the best move. So now back to the conversation about the port contract that we've proposed. As you all recall, we passed AR 2019-94 on April the 4th. The procurement department put the bid out or the RFQ out, and on April 15th we had a single response to that. April 16th, a subcommittee of this committee, Mr. Rivera, Ms. Quinn-Davidson, and myself met with Mr. Spees from the procurement department to review the bid that we received. The procurement department noted that the bid met the standard to be acceptable, and then left it to us to review the details. Because of procurement rules being what they are, we can't share with you the bid at this time. It only can go public when the award is made. But we have reviewed the document, and we're here to have a conversation because what was determined from that subcommittee meeting was that the proposal looks good, acceptable, and we would like to interview the bidders. And so we have invited them here, and now would be the time to come on down, folks. Whomever wants to come on up, please.
What's their name?
The bid that was submitted as Ascent, which is a project management company, and then a subcontract with Northern Compass Group. And you know, the scope of work, when you look, I guess you don't have that at all in front of you, do you? So what I do have is, I can hand this out. This is the AR that was approved by the membership, and it lays out the scope. And not exactly the same terms. There were some slight word changes, but if you go to the wrong document got attached to the back. We screwed that one up. Okay, so I have it here though. The scope of work was as follows. Within the context of the design criteria imposed for this program, independently confirm why costs have risen so much. 2, identify options for program development and sequencing to include resiliency requirements for the roll-on, roll-off docks and the crane cargo dock, whether or not imposed design criteria should be maintained or changed to save cost. Identify engineering issues and practicality for options, including geotechnical analysis. Identify costs associated with priorities for port users and design and financing options for those priorities. Calculate the tariff implications of the various options. Identify potential funding sources and financing scenarios for the development. And discuss with port users how improvements can be funded and whether there are opportunities for different delivery methods. And finally, to compile a project book and draft strategic plan. And essentially, the review criteria were how are they going to achieve this within the budget that was proposed. And so there were several very specific items. But now I would like to open up to members who reviewed the document and were at that review for any comments or input before we start a conversation with the bidders. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to give some quick comments, and then unfortunately I do have to leave and then come back for the Budget and Finance Committee meeting. So after review, and thank you, Mr. Constant, for organizing this with Mr. Spees and Mr. Haddon, who I believe he was in Hawaii when he was helping us organize this. So thank you to him and Ms. Quinn Davidson for being part of this process. So Mr. Sturdelewski was apparent that he has extensive experience working with the Assembly. And particularly there was one project exploring costs with the PAC that he worked with the Assembly on. So he has done this similar process before. Granted, that was a much smaller scale project. And extensive experience with the municipality and on maritime projects. We also have the added bonus of the Northern Compass Group, Mark and Shauna. After review, I was very comfortable that they would be able to meet these requirements. Okay.
Sure, I can just add the same thing. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this subcommittee. All the criteria were met. I thought the proposal was well put together. A lot of experience, both with port work in Alaska in various different ways. So I thought it was impressive. I think we had a couple questions. I just appreciate you guys being here.
And so let's start there. Questions? Or maybe you guys want to introduce yourselves first?
Yeah.
You can do it either way.
I'm Rose Sturzelewski with Ascent. I was born in Old Providence and have lived here most of my life. I was Public Works Director out in Alaska for 7 years, and but I've primarily been here. I'm a degreed engineer. I've worked as a geotechnical engineer. I've managed 2 container ports both in Kodiak and Unalaska. And more than that, I'm a long-term Alaskan Anchorage resident, and I would like to make sure that we can come up with a solution here. So it's a thorny problem that is challenging, and how do you fund this project? And I think the team that we've gotten together, I've worked with Mark before, and we've had great collaboration, and I would love to be able to help solve this problem, and I really thank the Assembly for taking a hard look at this. It's a huge issue that needs to be solved.
Good afternoon, my name is Shauna Toma, and I'm the Vice President of Northern Compass Group. I've had a long career so far working in government and mainly on infrastructure and transportation activities because I like it. I think it's really important for our country and our state, and something like the port is especially important because it's how we get our supplies. And I know that, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. Necessity is the mother of invention, and I feel that people do know what we need to do for our port here. I'm not afraid of working on top projects. And also, I've done a lot of work working with people around the state, from little villages to hubs to working out some pretty big issues with aviation and other big economic activities tied to transportation. So I'm excited to work on this. I hope we get to do that. I think we have a lot to offer the community here, and the time is right now.
I'm Mark Baggage, and actually, Will and I were both born in that hospital, which has now been Haas. So, yeah, things have changed. Again, I've worked on a variety of projects, but this one is a complex, most largest project we just completed through Northern Compass Group, where we were instrumental behind the scenes and on an ongoing basis, was the project you all worked on, several of you, which was the MLP and GH merger, which was very complex. And multiple years of work on it, a lot of effort over the last 40 years on that project, and through a lot of work that we engaged with a lot of stakeholders, and as a result, that's today we're moving forward on that project. This one, maybe no one wanted to touch this project because it's so complex, and that's why we're here. I think we like these kind of projects. Joe and I have worked together on a variety of things over the years, and We just think there are opportunities to solve this problem. It takes some little bit of ingenuity, a lot of work with stakeholders, understanding not only here in the state, but also our partners that we deal with in Washington State when we ship products up here, how that all works. And I think we have some creative ideas and are excited about engaging this for a long-term solution for Alaska's part.
All right, now questions.
Can I ask for?
Please.
Sorry, Ms. Sheets. I was just going to ask you to, I was really impressed in the scope or in the proposal you provided with the experience you have specifically for sort of technical experience, but I don't think since all the members haven't had that opportunity, would you mind just explaining some of the projects you've worked on in the past and how it applies to this?
So I mentioned Unalaska Dutch Harbors. It's the #1 seafood volume port in the nation, and I actually was in this very building back in 1989. I had just completed working on the Performing Arts Center, and the former city manager Ron Garzini came up to me and asked me if I was interested in moving to Unalaska. And if people remember back in those days, that was basically the bottom of the construction market. Unalaska was booming. Anchorage was, nothing was happening. And so as a younger man, I jumped at the opportunity to move out there. And so that really was my first involvement in port projects. And the project that was being worked on was a 731 lineal feet container crane for, at the time it was Sealand. And that project was a public-private partnership that integrated in two private sector individuals with the city, and we did a revenue bond and had a very successful project, and it's continuing to go there. But Unalaska had 5 different marine facilities there, and I had done a number of smaller projects there. I helped initiate the Carl Moses boat harbor, which was just in the initiation stage when I was there, but it ultimately got constructed. So that I was 7 years in Unalaska. Just recently, in completion in 2016, a pile-supported container crane dock in Kodiak. Somewhat similar conditions. It was marine clays, very terrible soil conditions, although we did have the benefit of bedrock at depth, so it was pile supported. I helped participate in the whole delivery of that project. I worked collaboratively with the city of Kodiak in terms of helping with the preferential use agreements and tariff elements. So those are, and I also was project manager for Valdez and project advisor for the boat harbor there. So I've done a fair number of marine facility projects.
Thank you.
Mr. Dunbar?
I think you just answered I have 2 questions, actually. Actually, 3. First, Mr. Sergelucci, could you say your first name again?
So my first name is Bernard. My middle name is Rowe, and I go by Rowe.
Okay, Rowe. Yeah, I was making sure I didn't mishear that.
R-O-E, sorry.
What's that?
It's Rowe,
Like
R-O-E.
fish roe.
Okay, great. That's very Alaskan middle name.
Germain.
Yeah, I grew up in Cordova, and it was a very valuable export for us. So you said you were a project manager. Is your background in construction management or engineering, or can you be a little more specific about your role?
So my degree was in civil engineering.
Okay.
Outside of, I'd worked as prior to that, I worked in the labor union. I worked on the pipeline. I worked other building elements. Outside of school, when I graduated, I went and did 2 years of geotechnical engineering, and I decided that wasn't necessarily for me. And I got into construction project management. That was back in the day of Project 80s. I did a large number of municipal and school district projects there. And I've been doing vertical and horizontal construction projects since then. So I have completed coursework for Arctic engineering at the university, including a class in coastal engineering. So I'm not a licensed professional engineer, but I also have an MBA. So, I look at integrated solutions, both financial and technical, and I'm also, and why I like working with Mark and Shauna so much is I'm a collaborator, and I like hearing input and assimilating all the details to come up with solutions.
So,
Because Mr. Dyson's in the queue.
okay, then one follow-up then. Thank you for all that. I really appreciate that. And I think we talked about when we put this on the street that we kind of, for $100,000, what we're asking for is kind of impossible. All the things.
45,000.
Oh, 45,000. Okay, well, 45,000. So all the different things we need in one person is kind of impossible. So I appreciate that we have a sort of a variety of people. I guess my question then for you, Mark, is, ultimately we have a problem that is, I think, primarily an engineering problem. We don't really understand what exactly we can and cannot do. But we also have a political problem, and people are sort of wrapped up in this, right? And I'm just wondering how you're going to overcome the sort of perception of, you were mayor while phases of this whole thing were going on, correct? Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, how do you avoid that perception from the public?
Yeah, I first want to make clear, I agree with you that this is a complicated problem. It has both engineering issues, but it also has how do you move this off the ground? Because you can talk about the price and the cost all day long, or you got to move it. So, to your core question is, actually I oppose the way this was done in 2009, and I'll just give you a quick history. In 2003, when I got elected, a week before I got sworn in, the former administration, along with the assembly at that time, made the agreement with MIRAD to cut the city out of the deal, basically. 1 week before I got sworn in a special session meeting, because they knew I opposed that idea. Because MIRAD had never done a project. MIRAD had never done anything of this magnitude. And because of that, they did not have the skills and capacity to do it. Well, once that was agreed to and the memorandum of understanding was done, MIRAD was in control of the project and development and construction. One of the things I did, because back then they said it was going to be a $350 million project, I disagreed. I thought it was going to be at that time 700 plus. It should be broken up into 5 phases. Because if you don't do that and try to do it as one single phase, as they were trying to do, it becomes a bigger problem. But at the end of the day, even when in 2009 occurred, when I was no longer mayor, when I was in the Senate, we initiated an effort to find out exactly what happened, because MIRAD was in charge. Now I was in the U.S. Senate, and I had a little different lever to pull. And we did. We had an IG report done on them. They acknowledged that they had made mistakes. They acknowledged the contractor had made mistakes, but again, all in the control of MIRAD. So I wish it was a little more simpler, but because that project was isolated out through a memorandum of understanding, the administration, when I took over as mayor, knew my opposition to what they were going to do, and that's why they did the meeting they did. And cut the city out of it, in essence.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that?
Okay.
So, sorry, Mr. Dyson, but I think this is an important line of inquiry. So, I mean, one of our challenges is we had a meeting, and an engineer, not sure what, I don't recall his name, came and presented an alternative proposal to the administration's proposal, which basically used the lands that the failed MIRAD project
Just
as a
quick
base.
interjection. Not the administration's proposal, the contractor's proposal.
CH2M Hill's
Yes.
proposal, right? Okay, so you have CH2M Hill's proposal, and then you have this alternate proposal, which sort of uses the lands at least created by the MIRAD project.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, if you were opposed to that project, are you worried at all that there'll be sort of an accusation of bias that you might lean against one project or the other because you had been opposed to a different version of that project at an earlier date?
Yeah, I don't think so, Forrest, because my opposition was MIRAD taking control of the project, and that was what was concerning to me. The other piece, to be very frank, if and this is why I think this team is so valuable, if you spend your time just rehashing what happened, you can't get to where you need to go. And where you need to go is decide, is this the Alaska port? What is the avenues of opportunity, recognizing the challenges through engineering and other options that may be out there, and then manage the political, public process at the same time. This project has always gone on over the last few years. Basically, let's just try to get this moving. Reports are usually done on engineers, and then it's a cost issue. The fact is, you got to figure out, how do we get this off the dime? And I think, one, and I will give credit to Sullivan that he got it out of NIRAD's hands and back in the city's hands. And the Assembly was very supportive of that. That gives the opportunity for the city to now take the level of where they want to go, but it can't be just an Anchorage project. This is a state project. And I think we have to kind of re-examine how it's looked at. So I don't think there's a bias. I'm glad NIRAD's not part of it, to be very frank with you, because they couldn't do a project like this. And so I think the real issue is this is kind of a fresh way to look at it. Instead of an engineer trying to explain what they did or trying to explain why they think there's a better alternative, you're getting a team that says, we're going to look at it all. But we're also going to look at once you analyze that, what do you do next? Because if you don't figure out what you do next, then it'll be a nice report you all paid for and look at. And then a year from now, you'll say, well, what happened? Well, you got to get it down the road. So that's how I see this. It's not, again, I use MLP and tree edge as an example. I have been attempted 3 different times. Also, I think Senator Dyson was on the Assembly at one point when that was attempted back in the day of the Knowles administration. That failed multiple times for a variety of reasons. So you had to kind of step back and say, okay, what's the goal? Once that goal is established, we can move forward. But part of it is you have to look at where you've been and then step forward. And that's what I think this effort should be about. And I think that's what you assigned us to do.
Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, before us to ask most of the questions I was going to do. And just in declaration, I've known Ro for quite a while. We're not friends, we're certainly acquaintances. I was a great fan of his mother, and still am. And she tried hard not to like me. But it ended up kind of giving into, and so on. And Mark and I served on the Assembly together. How many years did we overlap?
A few years, about 4 years, yeah.
Really, and whatever you might think about Mark, he's really bright, and he's focused and good at getting things done. And he knows a whole lot of the history here and kind of the political environment in which all these decisions were made, the financial. I think that's an asset to it, significant asset. And were you working at Dutch when Paul Hughes was there? Yeah, Paul was a great buddy. He was there when my daughter wrote her best-selling novel set in Dutch Harbor. And so I know about Ro's work from some other, for me, credible sources.
Thank you. Any other inputs, questions, comments? Mr. Weldon?
So we only had one bidder. Is it just the market for this? Because now you will never work on this port again. You advise us and you can't do any work on this huge, wonderful project.
So actually, that's a good point. I made a point in the record because the language is a little imprecise, but what I said in the record when we made that vote was future construction of the port. And so it is my hope that if this works out, that we can in fact continue to work in consulting with them, build a relationship, go back out to bid. If someone else can compete, great. But it's not they're excluded from any future work helping the Assembly on the question of the port. But it's certainly, at least for some reasonable time into the future, I'm sure it's not never, because there are whole flops of development that could happen between now and the next 30 years, that the idea is that they aren't going to be bidding on future construction work in this process.
So I got that, but there's not much money working for us. There's a lot of money designing with a pile of providers.
Right. Please.
Actually, that was a unique part of your request in this, your RFQ, because my experience has taught me sometimes when you have the consultant who then becomes the bidder to construct, it tips to where Senator Dunbar was going. Sometimes you become not by design, but by default, into a biased approach. And I think what you're getting here is kind of just hands off. We're going to be clean and right up front, very transparent. Rose Group, same thing. I think that's a unique way you've done this RFQ, different than a lot of others where it doesn't exclude you from future work. I think this is actually smart.
I agree with it. I just,
we recognize that
a lot of money's going to be sitting out there you can't touch.
One, I will tell you, I had outreach from a number of potential bidders, and they basically said that because of the low number of the potential award and the fact that they wouldn't be working on big $1 million contracts, they weren't going to bid. And I had zero heartburn when I heard them say that. I mean, you are not the one we want, right? The one we want is the one who's going to be a statesman, stateswoman, and lead with us on the question rather on the more important issue of how are we going to do this than where's the profit motive. And so, core value. Ms. Elton.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, the public is really already in an uproar about this project. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience as a team in communicating complex ideas to the public, particularly this may be multi-year phase project, maybe something similar you've done?
Yeah, well, I'll start. And I think I've done this all my life. Across the street is a building that failed at the ballot box the year before I took it on as mayor. And people told me don't do it because only 30% of the people supported it. And part of the process is we believe in the work, and that's example, municipal light and power, 2H merger. Not everyone wakes up talking about how you merge two utilities. So that took 2.5 years of work, working with a variety of personalities, individuals, groups, organizations that didn't necessarily work together well at the beginning. The public had to be brought along, and we were very successful in getting 65% of the voters to approve that. But it's a constant flow. What I mean by that is you set the goal, like an MLB 2H, the goal was we believe that instinctively people would ask the question, why haven't we done this? So the goal was, how do you get there? And so it wasn't a straight line, and you had to kind of constantly move a little bit. We engaged the community. In that case, we engaged the business community. We engaged the community at large. We met with talk show hosts, Conservative Talk Radio, before we launched that project to get engagement, understand where they might be going. We met with a variety of stakeholders. This project across the street, and I'm using big ones. There's a lot of others, but this process, how to do it. You step back first and you map everything out. You determine where those connects are, where the stakeholders are, who's been engaged, who has not been engaged, what are the positives, what are the negatives, and then figure out how to attack them with information. Sometimes just engaging people is a big part of it. A lot of times in projects of this nature, you read a certain thing and then you disengage or you never get contacted. And so the other pieces you got to be very transparent about. And I think in this one, there's been a mixed bag, and I think a lot of it has been, well, what's happened, why has it happened, versus what is the goal here? The goal is we have a port that serves 80+% of the state and our consumer goods. And if I went to Fairbanks today and asked about the Alaska port, because that's the new name, they'd say, what port is that? If I said it's the Anchorage port, they'd say, oh, that's that port, that's your port. And so there's a lot of work to make this a much broader perspective. But that's how we've done it. It's not easy, but you have to figure out where those stakeholders are. Sean has worked with me for 16 years, I think now, and a variety of things that we have worked on. And it's really about engaging people where they're at and understanding where their concerns are versus telling them what the answer is.
So if Mr. Trainee were here, I presume he would say to you, it's the Port of Alaska.
Yes, there you go.
Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe the information is up here, I can't quite read it, but would you speak to the time frame and where do you begin when starting a review like this?
So our response to the request, and it asked for an anticipated deadline, and we indicated by September 15th of this year. And the request asked for a number of different elements, and while they're laid out in a linear fashion, they kind of cross over in a number of elements. And so I really want to address one question back here, but all the people in this room are stakeholders in this project, and they have different roles. The assembly has a role, the administration has a role, the port has a role, the project managers have a role, the people that you're seeing in the audience have a role. And what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to align all of those interests, and we need to come up with a solution that's going to work. So do you as the assembly want to raise, we just had a bond issue, and one of my favorite bonds failed, and that was the library. But in that issue was a $5.5 million bond, and that would have raised $1.25 per $100,000 taxation. If we did this project if we did a general GO bond, we would be looking at over $400 per $100,000. So somebody with a 300,000 home, which is modest, $1,200. $500,000 home, you're looking at $2,000. You're looking at, you have people out here in the audience. You're looking at going from a revenue requirement of $11 million a year to over $200 million a year for phase 2. Is that something that is going to be palatable? Well, it isn't. And so what is that solution? And it's figuring out all the interconnections like Marcus talked about, where you can put together a solution. And it's working in a real collaborative fashion with industry, with the administration, with the assembly, and coming out. And we as a community need to solve this problem. It's not something, we can't continue to put Band-Aids on it. We all know what's going to happen if we don't solve this. The port's going to fall down. And I was down I was working in the boardroom offices down there when the earthquake hit. And it shook, and I was here in '64, and we need to solve the problem, and there is a solution. So we just need to put we need to coalesce as a group with all these different stakeholders here and solve it. We don't have any other choice.
Last comment.
Real quick, there's also a reason if you look at your RFQ, you had a much longer period of time. We're already thinking now how to strategize on this. We shortened that to 120, and the reason we did that, or the way we shortened it, is because we wanted to make sure whatever we proposed, or ideas, or concepts, or the answers to these questions, was to prepare you for your own budget cycle. Because otherwise, you would have been in the middle of the budget cycle, setting your legislative priority and your federal legislative list. So even in this RFQ, we're thinking of a strategy of how do you start this process today. So when you see that it's shorter, we're a little pressured under that short timetable, but we thought, well, if we go too long, then you're going to miss a whole nother cycle. So that's where this kind of collaboration with this team is figuring literally from the day we canvass RFQ about what happens next. And
all right. So from the procurement perspective, the committee of 3 could have authorized this to move forward, and it would have been sufficient. And we did all agree that it's a valid and good project proposal, but we wanted to bring it to this committee now. And so my question to the committee as a whole is there objection, since we have only one bidder and there's a subcommittee that has decided it's good, is there any objection to allowing the procurement department to move forward with this contract?
Has the period closed?
Yes, we didn't get them until the period closed.
Okay.
We only have one bid, and the bid, according to the members, is responsive. So, Mr. Wilson.
So does this go through the normal, we get a resolution at the assembly on
No,
Tuesday?
and so, no, but what you will have on Tuesday is an AIM that I've drafted that includes all of the records and timelines of everything that we've discussed and that have been approved, including the conclusion of this committee. So, Mr. Haddon told me just on the phone yesterday, all we need to do is say, go for it and be fruitful, and the procurement department will do that.
So it's 50,000.
Yep. So is there any objection? Okay.
Do that?
Hearing none.
These committees?
we're not taking a vote. There's no objection though, so we've already had a conversation and we have agreed, and according to Mr. Haddon, that's sufficient to trigger the next step of the process. And so what you will see introduced into the addendum tomorrow is an AIM that includes all the records that have been presented. It probably won't have the bid because I'm told that can't happen until the contract is signed, and that might take 2 days. It'll have everything but that, and then that will come forward as soon as it's publicly available. You'll have a copy of it.
I realize you're just short on time. You're trying to get through this, but if there was an objection, what would be the process? I mean,
We would
is
have
that-
a conversation and maybe a vote.
Yep.
Okay. Hearing none, then we are out of time. I wish we had a few more minutes to allow for important audience participation. But we're going to gavel up for the Budget Committee.